Hello, everyone, and good afternoon from Utah. My name is Lori Gagan, and I'm your host today on the Wellness Crusaders Talk Radio Show. I will be joined today by Dr. Richard Fleming, lead contributor to 10letters.org, which we will be talking about later on our show. Dr. Fleming is the author of Is COVID-19 a Bioweapon? A must-have book for everyone to understand how the spike protein, which is really known now as the deadly disease, COVID-19, got its start. Dr. Fleming is also the author of Stop Inflammation Now, a book that he wrote in 1994, one of my most favorite books, and kind of really what we are seeing right now with the inflammothrombotic response that people get from the disease, COVID-19. His most recent book is Endangered Species, Bioweapons, Eugenics, and More. It's already been released. You can actually purchase that book on Amazon and several other places. That book also kind of lays out really how and when all of everything that we now know as disease and what the government actually has been doing with it that goes back to 1800s and the history on that book, because it was a book that I actually honestly didn't want to read. It's not that I don't like history, but it was something I wasn't really interested in until I picked up and started reading chapters 1 and 2, and I could not put the book down. So for any of you that are interested in the history of actually how SARS-CoV-2 started, is COVID-19 a bioweapon, is a must-have. Anybody struggling with inflammation, the book that he wrote on Stop Inflammation Now and his newest book, Are We the Next Endangered Species? Bioweapons, Eugenics, and More. So Dr. Fleming's research into SARS-CoV-2 began in January of 2020, but his research in the gain of function led him all the way back to 1999, when the U.S. Department of Health began funding research looking at infectious diseases. So we're talking today on a little bit of what I like to call misinformation, and that's the nicotine patch, and really how people are using it with the long haul COVID. But I still think people have not the truth and really what's happening with the nicotine patch, because the last time I looked, I recently had a friend of mine from Utah send me over something that was the cleanest one. There isn't anything out there that is organic. So then you have to ask yourself, what type of chemicals are you putting that your body is going to absorb via the skin, which is actually one of your biggest organs where you take in the most amount of toxins. So before we get started with Dr. Fleming, I just want to read you just some information on our mission statement, what the Wellness Crusaders is all about. So the Wellness Crusaders internet radio show on kmmu.org is four of us and my co-hosts, Kathleen Halal, Patty Reese, Jessica Endicott, as we weave together the critical and often overlooked aspects of wellness, including the role of soil health. Our engaging series unveil a crucial truth that the health of our soil is deeply intertwined with nutrition, climate, and the sustenance of life on Earth. For years, the rampant use of chemical farming methods has drastically depleted essential soil nutrients, leading to a decline in plant health and our overall well-being. Our podcast emphasizes that nutrient-rich, high-quality food is the foundation of our mental, physical, emotional, and spiritual health. We address the critical issues of our diets being deficient in essential nutrients, amino acids, a problem which is increasingly linked to the rising mental and physical health challenges that we are seeing here in Utah, but we are really seeing it across the world. We not only highlight these issues, but we also provide answers and solutions. We uphold the wisdom of Hippocrates. Let food be thy medicine, and medicine be thy food. We are committed to empowering lives, inspiring wellness, and offering solutions. So I'm going to introduce Dr. Fleming. Well, hello, young man. How are you doing this evening?
I'm doing well. How are you, Lori?
You know what? I am actually really excited about this particular podcast. And the reason I know there's a lot of false information on it, we see, across the board, these, doctors talking about the nicotine patches and how it helps with long haul. I do already have several questions on board on, could something like that help with ALS? And I really am so curious on how you are going to answer how it impacts the brain's reward system. So we'll get right to it. So growing up, both of my parents smoked. So I guess when I was in the car, I smoked because there were four of us, three of my brothers, and myself, and my parents smoked, and the windows were barely cracked, and they both smoked. So it was horrific. So I'm assuming that I'm a secondhand smoker for the time that I was living at home. My dad did pass away of colon cancer. He did work in a steel mill, so I'm sure that probably led to some of the toxins in his body. More importantly, I do know that smoking had definitely impacted his health. So there are over 1 billion people who smoke, and we know that smoking is very addictive and really how it impacts some of the neurotransmitters in the brain. So over the 50 years, tobacco companies have leveraged science to manipulate tobacco to make it more addictive. Big profit over people's health, chemical rape that continues to harm poison or continues to harm the people. So let's start with the chemical compound like bronchodilators that also make that easy to enter the lung. So with your vast knowledge, being a research scientist and all of the other degrees that you have, including your JD degree, let's talk about that and kind of break that down. Why and how it may be helpful or detrimental to somebody's health.
So are you talking about just the fact that they try to bronchodilate or enlarge the airways with cigarettes, or are we talking
Yes, the compounds, whatever they are putting in it, so that
right?
the nicotine enters the lungs more easily.
Well, one of the one of the things that people don't understand is the impact of nicotine, and there's a receptor known as the acetylcholine receptor. It functions in many nerve endings throughout the body. At higher doses, it activates what's known as the nicotine receptor. At lower doses, it activates a receptor known as the muscarinic receptor. So the lower doses are going to be activated when you get too much nicotine, and the consequence of that is to tighten your airways, to cause bronchoconstriction. So to get the cigarette and the addictive compounds into the lungs, where you're going to increase the uptake of nicotine and the stimulatory effect of that, you need to do something that will open those airways back up. So one drug is actually treating the consequence of the nicotine so that you'll get more nicotine and more addictive effects. So that's why they need to have those types of chemicals in there. If they don't do that, your airways close down, you don't get as much of the nicotine. You don't get the addictive component.
Okay. So a follow-up question, like somebody like me, who I've never really smoked except the secondhand smoke I got through my parents. Why do some people get sick, nauseated when they're either around there, especially like in cigars, which I'm assuming has like way more nicotine than a cigarette?
Because that's one of the side effects. That's part of the receptors in your GI tract that are stimulated by the nicotine. I had a class of students that were high school students that I was doing a smoking cessation program on. And to get the idea across to them of what nicotine was really doing to them, I listened to how much nicotine, how many packs of cigarettes a day they were smoking. And then I gave them a higher dose of the nicotine patch so they could feel the effect. And that really got through to them because it made them nauseated. It made them sick in a lot of other ways. And it was very helpful to get them off the cigarettes once they realized the consequence, because some of the students were already smoking 3 packs a day compared to the 1 pack a day. And when the 1 pack a day students had the larger dose added, they got that nausea. The 3 pack a day students had gotten used to it. So it wasn't, they just ignored it. They'd gotten used to it, kind of like the old fluorescein lights that we used to hear all the humming and buzzing on. People would drown that out after a while. And you got used to it, so you stopped paying attention to the signals of your body.
Okay. All right. I'll go on to the next question because I'm really curious on the nicotinic acetylcholine receptors. But I know Dwayne actually had a really good question. Him and I have kind of been going at it for the last couple of days, trying to, figure out like really good questions for this. But so why are there nicotine receptors in the brain? And are those nicotine receptors, this will kind of lead me into the second question, are they the nicotinic acetylcholine receptors or are they nicotine receptors?
Okay, so you don't have nicotine receptors. You have acetylcholine, which is a neurotransmitter. And those receptors, there's several different types. Some of them at the higher doses of acetylcholine react to nicotine. And the lower dose ones we call muscarinic, but they're still acetylcholine, and they respond to lower doses. So the nicotine is stimulating the acetylcholine receptor. There's not a separate nicotine receptor.
Okay, and are there a lot of them?
So acetylcholine is a very common neurotransmitter. And so that's what the nicotine is stimulating. It's very similar to it. Okay. You have opioid receptors in your body, and that's what the morphine stimulates. You don't have a specific morphine receptor. So this is an example of nicotine is very close. It mimics the acetylcholine. It fits in the acetylcholine receptor. And then you can see there's several genes that play a role in either the breakdown of the nicotine so it clears, and so if it doesn't clear, there's an addictive problem. The dopaminergic activity associated with it, which is that pleasure hit that people talk about. Dopamine is another neurotransmitter. Serotonin or 5-hydroxytryptamine is another one. The opioid I already mentioned, that was with morphine. So in each one of these cases, they're looking at very specific reasons for why somebody would be more prone to being addicted to this drug. The same thing's true of alcohol, cocaine. One of my friends that I trained with as a cardiology fellow, Nora Volkow, is the NIH senior investigator for positron emission tomography brain imaging. And Nora worked on these receptors. When I was a fellow We looked at the marijuana effects in the brain and what areas of the brain lit up when marijuana was used. There is not a marijuana receptor, but it lights up substantial areas of the brain that counter each other. So there's a drug that's actually activating multiple receptors, causing the brain neurons to fight each other in function. Because again, while people may like these drugs, that doesn't mean that you should be taking them into your body. There's a consequence. And we always talk about this homeostasis phenomenon, or at least I try to when I'm discussing things. And what people forget is this very fine-tuned balance that exists that you can easily overwhelm by ingesting things, either inhaling or drinking or eating. And as you mentioned earlier, the skin is the largest organ in your body, of your body, and it has a massive absorptive area from which toxins can get across into your body.
Okay, so let's talk about one thing that you mentioned just a little bit further. Do you believe that marijuana is a gateway drug to other drugs? And I'm thinking from the teenager aspect, the 14, 15, 16, 17-year-olds that, they think that not only just nicotine, but marijuana, which is like all the rage. Do you consider that a gateway drug to other drugs?
So I've heard both arguments, and I was involved in these arguments in the 1960s and 1970s, because at that point in time, that was one of the discussions. And it turns out that both sets of arguments are true. Most people that go on to higher level narcotic addictive drugs start at marijuana. They don't tend to start at the more aggressive drugs. They don't tend to go out and get heroin first. They tend to get these recreational drugs as they're going through them, and as they methamphetamine's another example. The more you use of these drugs, the more your body accommodates. Like the 3-pack per day students didn't notice the nausea as much as the 1-pack per day because they had developed tolerance. And when you need more to get the same effect, that tolerance leads to more and more craving psychologically and physically. Adolf Hitler's pilots lost the Battle of Britain because Adolf Hitler's best pilots were put on methamphetamines, and they had to keep upping the dose. And by the time the Battle of Britain occurred, they had upped the dose so much to keep the effect up that they had gone over the plateau, over the peak, and had started a decline in function. And that happened during the Battle of Britain. So there's always a point at which these drugs get added in dose, and then you seek the next drug for the effect. And it doesn't mean that you have to. I mean, there's a lot of parameters. One is, why did you start using any given drug to begin with? And then two, what were the encouragements, reinforcers? As an experimental psychologist, I approach this now. What are the reinforcers that continue to get you to use those drugs in contrast to other behaviors that might not be as physiologically harmful?
Okay. All right. That makes sense. And before I go on to the next question, you mentioned like a study, and I know there's a lot of pharmaceutical studies out there and we can talk about like even an example of radioisotopes, that how do they get people to volunteer to be an experimental guinea pig on a nicotine subject where you're feeding them more nicotine to see how much nicotine it takes for that person to vomit? Pretty much is how I look at nicotine.
So, a lot of research that's done with people, it just depends upon the person. I have had no difficulty recruiting patients and keeping patients in my studies, but I employed a method that my mother taught me early on, which was to really look at people and say, listen, this may not help you, but it may help someone you care about in the future. And every benefit that we have medically has more or less been tested by somebody before you who said, okay, I'll let you sort it out. And I think the better part of human nature is to say, okay, I have a health problem and there's a potential here, maybe for me, but maybe more so than me, my children, my grandchildren, people I care about. And that's really a lot of that. There are some researchers that I have questions about, and I put my foot down, so to speak, and rejected participation in studies that I thought that they were basically just taking people who needed the money and said, well, we'll pay you to do this, and the people don't realize that there's a potential harm, or they think it's going to be okay, or they're only going to go through this for a while and they need the money. And I have real concerns with that ethically. And so I have pushed back every time that has been done. Um, and I've done some research that I think when you think about it is kind of interesting. I mean, I've put leeches on people to see if it helps with blood clots in their extremities. When I was a cardiology fellow, now we were looking at the drug Herudin, which is what the leeches make. But at that point in time, we literally were taking forceps and putting leeches on people and taking the old ones off. So, if you ask too many people, I don't think there's a lot of people who've been involved in research where they've gone into the coronary care unit and said, you've got clotting in your arm, you want to be a part of this research, But that was the research at the time, and it's amazing how many people will do that if you approach it from the perspective of, we can't guarantee this will help you, but it will help us understand and maybe help somebody in the future, and you're getting the benefit from people before you who volunteered and stepped forward.
Okay. All right. So I'm going to get into the next question. And I think that the answers to these questions by you, I mean, you're very highly credentialed. There's a lot of false information. You see a lot of podcasts, IG posts by Dr. Brian artists. And basically, I think the information that some of these doctors are feeding is kind of misinformation because of also the toxins that are being absorbed into the body. And that's the one thing that I don't like. That's the one thing that the Wellness Crusaders is all about, is really talking like no poison, less poison. And I don't feel that the poison that you're putting in your body has any benefit at all. So there's a lot of misinformation. There may be some truths, but we're talking about unfiltered truth, and you kind of bringing this all out on truly what is the truth. So that's one of the reasons when people ask me, oh, what about Dr. Artis's theory? I'm like, there's a lot of misinformation in there because you don't know how you're harming your immune system and harming your brain. So we know that nicotine can play a role with behavior, with emotions, even with moods, and it can lead to addiction in the way that somebody behaves. The role of the nicotinic acetylcholine, and I know you called it wasn't acetylcholine, you had mentioned probably the
acetylcholine.
Yeah, and I've been always calling it acetylcholine. The
That's all right.
receptors.
Both pronunciations are used by people, so there's that's fine.
Kind of like vitamin C and vitamin C.
Well, one's correct and one's wrong. That's right.
Okay, so we know that they're involved in releasing the neurotransmitters. And in this day and age, there is so much dopamine that is driven by social media, the gaming, these kids that are just addicted to, playing all these games, and I mean, just the YouTube videos, all of that. But dopamine, which is joy, pleasure. We have glutamate, which could drive excitement because it's an excitatory neurotransmitter. And then you have GABA, which is a calming neurotransmitter, which 20% of your neurotransmitters are really there to calm you. The other ones are really there to excite you.
Right.
We
Gamma,
have the
gamma aminobutyric acid.
aminobutyric acid, yes. And then you talked about the serotonin and,
Right.
5-HTP
5-hydroxytryptophan. Right.
and norepinephrine, which really is just another exciting neurotransmitter, attention, stress response. But tell me about how nicotine mimics these acetylcholine receptors in the brain. Doing this research, basically, I came across a couple of papers and videos that basically when somebody is addicted and does smoke, that if there's the nicotine damage in the brain, that acetylcholine, it can lead to more acetylcholine receptors. Is that because of the damage? And can you explain how that acetylcholine receptor, how it works with the nicotine?
Right. So so the nicotine acts to stimulate the acetylcholine receptor.
Yes.
And when that happens, it causes the next neuron to fire. And you can fatigue a system by overstimulating it. Let's take 3 examples and try to wrap up some of the different concepts. One is diabetes mellitus. The reason why people have diabetes, sweet urine, is because their blood sugar is too high. But the reason their blood sugar is too high is because their body has much more sugar, glucose, either from the protein that they eat or the carbohydrates that they eat, because both get converted over to glucose. And when the cells are saturated with glucose, the insulin receptors downregulate, become less sensitive, which then requires more of them and more insulin to try to push it into the cell. So it's an overstimulation of the insulin receptors. In amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, there is too much glutamate. And so as a result of the overstimulation of glutamate coming from, glutamine, the amino acid glutamine, and the glial cells in the brain have problem converting it over, that increased glutamate causes a neural excitability and damage to the nerves, causing ALS or Lou Gehrig's disease, whatever you want to call it. But amyotrophic means the muscles are not being fed, and lateral means it's away from the center of the body, and sclerosis means hardening, for anybody wanting to know where those terms come from.
Thank you.
Then with the acetylcholine overstimulation due to nicotine, it causes the same fatiguing effect of the acetylcholine receptors. And in fact, there are some neurologic diseases that one can find that are the end result of that. So in every one of these situations, the diabetes, the ALS, or the increased nicotine, you're causing damage to the cells. They're becoming less responsive, and they're having health problems as a consequence. So 3 different examples where the same problem is occurring: overstimulation of a receptor by something being added to the body, or something the body can't break down very well, and there's a health consequence to it. And in the brain, that causes this neurologic deterioration in both ALS and the nicotine excess, and also the marijuana, the tetrahydrocannabinoid THC, that is the active ingredient of marijuana. So in all of those instances, it's the same phenomenon. So people like me would say, you might think people would eventually get the message. When you overstimulate a system, so that it can't compensate, you're causing harm. Additional problems with the nicotine, however, has to do with the fact that it promotes cancers. And we know it promotes cancers because there's been research that shows that nuclear factor kappa beta, which we've talked about in some of the presentations, interleukin 8, and a variety of other factors that cause this inflammatory thrombotic disease and cancers. The nicotine is actually impairing the body's function. In fact, the natural killer cells function, which is critical to recognizing cancer. So by telling someone to go consume nicotine, that this is their end all be all, because they're going to feel the high from it. So they think, well, he must know what he's talking about. And the bottom line is he doesn't. And that's, just straightforward. He does not. The premise of this was somebody collected data when people came into the hospital. Do you smoke? Do you not smoke? Do you have high blood pressure? Do you not have high blood pressure? Do you have diabetes? Do you not have diabetes? Do you have heart disease? Do you not? And they just checked boxes. And then somebody went back and looked at it and said, it doesn't look like as many of the smokers are showing up with COVID. That wasn't a study. That was a bunch of people randomly collecting information as people were coming into the hospital, and the hospitals are overwhelmed. And somebody says, doesn't look like there's as many of the smokers coming in here. I'm sorry, no, that's dumb. That's not a study. That is somebody saying, well, it doesn't look like there's as many pregnant women coming in here with COVID. I don't think there were as many pregnant women. So getting pregnant must be a treatment for COVID, right? Maybe that's why so many men want to become women. I don't know. But maybe artists can float that one out there for a while.
So I want to unpack this a little bit further. And so I think that's one of the things that really irritates me. I believe that there are certain times that you should test. You and I have discussed this. I believe that knowing the amount of heavy metals in the body, knowing the amount sometimes of Roundup herbicides, 2,4-D, some of the other herbicides and pesticides that we know can lead to an uptick in autoimmune disease and cancer, and other things. So you've got somebody like Dr. Artis out there pushing patches. But what he's not doing is he's not talking about what you and I are talking about, is to how nicotine can be addictive, how it can lead to an uptick in disease. And for me, I think that's something, even like Dr. Peter McCullough, and I don't want to bash them, they're MDs. I'm not, I'm a holistic health coach. But they want to push certain dietary supplements to treat maybe long haul COVID in nicotine, but you never hear about testing, end results. How do they know that it's working? Hey, you try this, you try that. But the nicotine patch is one of the most bothersome things, I think, that they're using, because they are not talking about the consequences to the body, to the brain, to the immune system. So with that said, let's just unpack this just a little bit further from what you've said. So my nurse practitioner friend Det had a question. Can there be, or is there, any type of neuroprotective effects that could be beneficial to conditions like Parkinson's, which we know Parkinson's people have lower dopamine. It's one of the things that, chemical poisons can kill off. But could it have any benefits in Parkinson's, Alzheimer's? You've already explained ALS. We have someone that was very curious about that, but you kind of basically said, hey, it could lead to cancer. Yeah. So, or to help improve cognitive function and reduce the symptoms without the trade-off of some autoimmune disease or some cancer-causing
Right.
ingredient that people, doctors, will recommend.
Right. So let me answer the question about artists saying that nicotine's not addictive. He's made the argument it's not addictive because he says when you listen to the smoking companies, they went to Congress and said it's not addictive.
Right.
You think maybe they might have that argument, and yet there's warning labels on it. So the answer is there isn't. Nicotine is harmful. It's been associated with Alzheimer's. I will tell you that I mentioned Nora Vocal with PET imaging. She and I, because I'm an antimatter specialist as a nuclear cardiologist, we're working with the positron emission tomography or antimatter camera. And so we were doing research on brain imaging, a priori imaging to shorten the time and to investigate a number of drugs. We know that those major metabolic abnormalities in the brain tissue, the longer you take them, the more adverse that effect is. And we can measure that by blood flow or metabolism. So ammonia compounds, FDG, rubidium is not very useful, but the first two are very useful for it. You can use oxygen compounds for water to look at those phenomenon. But in all of those instances, they are detrimental. There's data that shows that the nicotine can be associated with some cryogenic effect. Now, in contrast, I would say that there are some things like niacin, which is not nicotinic acid. Niacin as a vitamin has been shown to have some benefit. E64D or aloxastatin has been shown to have some benefit. High doses of vitamin C have been shown to have some benefit. You know, nicotine actually stimulates oxidative damage, which most people are aware is a bad thing, and that's the pathway in which it increases nuclear factor kappa beta that causes the cancers in people. So it's associated with certain types of glioblastoma brain cancers, right? So the trade-off on these, just because you mentally feel good, you know, people, I mean, that's why people typically take drugs. That's why meth addicts use methamphetamine. It's the reason why we have a fentanyl problem, because of the feeling that people get. It's the after effects, the consequences that are detrimental. And I get really annoyed with my colleagues that overprescribe these medications to people. When I was a medical student, we were, you know, the professor did a kind of a, let me give you an example model of, you give the patient morphine, which is a drug probably of the narcotics that I use more often than others, because it's very short acting. So I can control it. I can get it in. I can get on top of pain if I'm in the cath lab or they're having an MI and a blood clot, to buy them some time. It also is a diuretic, so it causes people to urinate, which decreases the workload on the heart. So I use it for that. But, you know, the reality is, you ask the patient, do you have pain? And they'll say, yes. Do you mind that you have pain? Oh no, I'm great. You know, well, that's not treating a problem. Okay. And so when we use these drugs, whether they are prescription drugs or recreational drugs that you can buy at you know, whatever place you want to buy it. So I won't single out any drug dealing cigarette dispensing unit. You know, the reality is you're just feeding a habit. And at a point in time where we're talking about making America healthy again, there's nothing sillier than saying, well, let's give them another drug. In contrast to some of the things that I mentioned, like niacin and vitamin C, and you know, if you're going to use a drug, at least use one like E64D, which has been shown to reverse the pyogenic disease and some of the inflammothrombotic response disease. Let's actually address the underlying problem versus masking a symptom and making people, well, they feel good. And by the way, I listened to artists at way too many meetings where he talked about he had patches and he put them on, but they were too much. So he cut the patches to put them on so he would get a lower dose. Well, the problem is that the patches are like a pill. They're encased to release the medicine slowly over time, controlled. When you cut them and you put them on your skin, you release the drug willy-nilly at large amounts. It's not a controlled, slower, lower release. You take a 21 milligram patch and you cut it in 3 parts. You're not getting 7 milligrams. You're getting 21 milligrams out of that portion that you just stuck on your arm, and it's dumping in it to you right away. It just doesn't last as long when you do it.
Which is then why people who try that will say that they got really sick because it was
Yeah.
too strong. And I guess that's just one of like the misinformation out there. They don't talk about that. And so now
I
you
don't
have,
think he has a clue. That's the problem. And that's part of the frustration I have because I'm in a position right now where I want people to trust the science and the physicians once again. But we're not going to get there while people are constantly throwing garbage at you because that's not transparency. That's not science. That is just voodoo.
well, and it's no informed consent,
Yeah.
which is kind of what we just got out of, but still going on.
Yeah.
And I
There's,
think
yeah.
that's really, I think one of the things that really disturbs me most is now we're throwing poison at people and we're not even doing anything to testing, which is going to lead to my next question. We've got that image up. So
Yeah.
DNA, the genes that we inherit. So I particularly like for myself and I have clients, I want to know the genes that I've inherited. It's not that I want to treat a genetic snip, but if something were to happen, I would want to know, could that have been in genetics? And I'll give you a prime example, little probably personal information. My grandmother is Japanese. She had breast cancer. She didn't die of breast cancer. And I know like all the rage, it kind of goes back to these bioidentical hormones that a lot of doctors like to push. Oh, you can stay young for when you're in your 60s and 70s. And I was always like, no, no, thank you, not interested. But I did my DNA with the company that I like out of Canada, the DNA company, back in 2015. And I inherited one of the most toxic estrogen genes, 16OH. But I wasn't like even interested in the bioidentical. I'm like, by the time you get to perimenopause, whatever, you treat your lifestyle, you're not taking in toxic foods and waters from your environment. However, we get back to looking at genetics. There are genes that you can inherit, both good and bad. Most people have heard, the genes load the gun, but your environmental factors pull the trigger, which is really true. Just because I have a toxic estrogen gene doesn't mean I'm going to have breast cancer. Now I can feed breast cancer by doing bioidentical hormones, synthetic hormones, what all the people that are looking at, I need to treat this, but they're not looking at what are like the side effects, like the science on it.
Right.
So we have that image up where we talk about genes. Unpack a little bit for our audience how genetics would play a role also in these nicotine patches not being beneficial and not being healthy, that could actually be feeding your immune system sickness.
Right. So if you have a genetic tendency, and that's how we describe it. I mean, it's called nurture versus nature. How you nurture what you put into the body versus nature, what you're genetically born with, and your predispositions. It can tell you that you have a greater potential to have a problem than somebody who maybe doesn't have that genetic sequence. That's really what it tells you. One of the major distinctions between FMTVDM and any other test that's out there.
And
Is
can you
it
tell us what
right? So some people
just so
abbreviate
that
that
they
as
know it?
Fleming method, but it's the patented method that I have. Full transparency, it's called the Fleming method for tissue and vascular differentiation and metabolism using same state singular sequential quantification comparisons, which
Yes.
is why it got put down to FMTVDM. And it measures what's going on near the cellular level within just a few cells of each other as cells change their metabolism based upon their genetics and change their blood flow based upon their metabolism. And that declares health problems. And because it's a quantitative system, and I've developed it into the AI package, which is what I presented at the American Society of Nuclear Cardiology this year, that it allows you to figure out the state of health throughout the body, then to try whatever a treatment is, and then remeasure and determine what that drug or treatment effect on you and your health scenario actually is. So where genes tell us you have a tendency or a predisposition, the question is, well, is it going to happen? I mean, when I was a senior honors student at Iowa doing sodium and wabane receptors for hypertension and salt sensitivity, we defined a marker, a wabane receptor on red blood cells. And so we looked at people at the end of the study and said, well, you could either go buy this $450 test, or basically we could see if your legs swell up when you eat salt. Which do you want, right? So being able to measure the marker tells you you have a predisposition, but it doesn't mean you're going to do that. It's like the BRCA1 and 2 genes, and Lynch Henry was
The BRCA genes for breast cancer
right.
that a
So,
lot of doctors taught about. Yeah.
right. So BR breast, CA cancer 1 and 2. A friend of mine discovered that. He's the man who discovered it. He didn't call it BRCA. He's now passed away. But he didn't call it BRCA. He called it BRCA 1 and 2. So I stay true to him with that. You have a 1 in 4 chance of having cancer with that. But most people think it means breast cancer. It could be breast cancer, ovarian cancer, uterine cancer, prostate cancer, GI cancer, but primarily hormonally driven cancers. Well, we've done research on that, and we've done research on BRCA 1 and 2, men and women, where we've looked at soy products. You know, what's the effect of soy? It's a pro-estrogen. And there's a debate, you know, is it good for you? Is it bad for you? Well, my answer to the debate is, now I can tell you what it would do to you, specifically you, independent of what we think it will happen to you. I can actually tell you what it will do to you. Measuring with FMTVDM, trying the soy product, remeasuring it, we saw women get better, men get better. We saw women and men get worse. So that's really kind of the key. The genes are telling us what your potential is, but you have a lot of genes and they all interact. And the more critical these genes are to your life-sustaining force, the more interconnected they are. Because, for example, eating, you need food to survive. So the interplay between the genes related to nutritional intake and whether you will have an inflammatory thrombotic response disease is quite sophisticated, because as you can imagine, if one system fails, you need multiple backups if it's the thing that's keeping you alive, right? I mean, that's why when we send people into space, we have 3 computer systems typically on spacecraft, the primary one and 2 backup ones, so that when the one fail, there's a third one to get you home, unless of course you're up on the space shuttle or on right now on this our current astronauts that have been stranded up there with their last little group on the science lab. But
okay, so let's close in this question a little. This question in the comment. So, talking about the brain, nicotine patches, it's affecting or it can affect these precious neurotransmitters,
Hmm.
the dopamine, the glutamate, the GABA, the serotonin, the 5-HTP, norepinephrine. Here's another one of my little pet peeves when I hear people talk about the nicotine patch. And if you could break the myth and always, I know you always do, but be the truth teller for our audience. If someone is on an SSRI, or, and it might be a twofold question, let's say somebody's on an SSRI, or somebody genetically has a defect in like the 5-HTP gene, or a COMT gene, or they've inherited a bad GAD gene, which actually has to do with GABA. And this is because I love the brain. And then they were to, which you go back to the doctors not testing, not looking at anything, but then they just say, hey, you have long haul COVID for whatever reason. Maybe you got, maybe you got COVID, you have long haul, maybe you took the shot and you got long haul. But they say, let's try these nicotine patches. Genetics and a nicotine patch. Tell me a little bit about how that could help, hurt, harm someone on medicine, someone with bad genes.
Well, the benefit of testing for any of these genetic differences that exist is to have an understanding that maybe your patient won't tolerate it as well, or might have an exaggerated response to the medicine you're putting it on. It doesn't matter whether it's nicotine or any of the neurotropic or psychiatric drugs that we use. I mean, there's a lot of different drugs, benzodiazepines, 5-hydroxytryptamine, serotonin compounds, basic classes of neurologic drugs that are given to people with no testing, really, by the vast majority of clinicians, particularly psychiatrists, who tend to be the ones to put people on these medications, to determine if there's a potential that they will have an adverse effect. And one of the frequent things that are noted in the physician's desk reference, and you'll hear these during commercials when people talk about them, is almost always, I shouldn't chuckle, it's the irony of it, of death and suicide by taking these drugs. And nobody is testing or asking fundamental questions. The anesthesiologist will ask you if certain people in your family have certain drugs that cause them a problem, because we know that with anesthesia, some drugs given to patients will not be metabolized correctly, and they could have a life-threatening response. But we don't see this with psychiatry. In fact, since my master's was in experimental psychology, I can tell you that most of the drugs used by psychiatrists, the MDs, are tested by psychologists, the PhDs or master's students, right? So the research is being done by one group, and the other group is throwing the drugs at people. And I would argue that they don't do a very good job of sorting it out. They don't do as good a job as I would like to see many of them do, figuring out if there's a problem. And, all of these genetic defects are going to play a role. If you have these genes that interfere with the clearance of nicotine, as the example that you're showing here on the screen, it's going to have an even more pronounced effect on the individual. And multiple metabolic problems, as you can see with the CYP2A6, throughout the body. And we know that there are consequences, whether it affects the nicotinic acetylcholine or the muscarinic acetylcholine, that can have an effect on heart rate, on breathing, on muscle function, on neurologic function. And these, so they become literally life-threatening scenarios when too much of the nicotine is in the body. and the body craves it because it's been used to overdrive these neurons. It depletes the neurons, it exhausts the neurons, and you're basically then left with neurons, brain tissue that can't function very well. It takes the higher dose even to function, but it has exhausted the neurons and basically beat them up, and they atrophy and are damaged.
And so could that lead to neuronal death, like in the brain cells? Again,
Abs-
they're not,
Absolutely.
that's like the disinformation, like they're not giving them that informed consent. Like they should be covering all of this and maybe doing some testing, not expensive testing. I mean, heck, a DNA test is like $300 with a good company.
You
But
know,
that's the misinformation out there that some of these doctors are giving, and I think it's doing more harm than good. But somebody like Brian Artis, who they're listening to, who are going out there in trying that, could be harmful to them.
and add insult to injury, um, just because somebody feels good when they take a stimulant doesn't mean that the long-term consequence is going to be they feel good. There's been a lot of criticism of the other side of the medical model with, well, they didn't give very much time to test out the effect of the genetic vaccines, or they didn't give very much time to do this, that, or the other thing. Well, if the argument is you're not giving enough time and you're not looking at the long-term consequences, you don't get to make that argument if you're one of the people doing that game.
Right.
Right? I mean, that's just, I think most people who listen to me know that I'm repeating. If we're going to have a level where I, as a scientist, and certainly if I get the position that I'm looking at in the Trump administration, am not going to tolerate the extremes from either side bashing at each other and then doing the very thing they're doing. We
Right.
can't rebuild trust or safety for science or medicine if we're not going to be transparent and honest and
I think what
diligent.
happened during COVID is it broke a lot of trust in their medical doctors. But can you just quickly like recap? Because I have a comment on something that you were talking about. And it's just in brain spec. Before I get to the final questions, can you recap for the audience any benefits? What would you recommend if you had a patient that had Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, maybe an elderly patient, maybe not? I mean, we're seeing an uptick in, the 40 and 50-year-olds, but they're technically not old. But any benefits? And if there were one or two, where would you suggest them to look for those benefits besides PubMed?
I think that the two issues that we're dealing with are the inflammatory diseases and the pyrogenic diseases. Now, this has been hitting, hopefully, everybody in the face for the last 5 years, as myself, McCarran and Rexy and Deinert and Huff have, established for people to please pay attention to this. That we know that E4D is probably aloxastatin, probably one of the major drugs that's beneficial. I'm saying that the FDA has kept it under wraps, and there aren't any active studies going on with it, even though it's the only one that's been shown to be effective really in traumatic brain injury or Parkinson's disease or Alzheimer's disease more than Parkinson's for that. There are other drugs that are available. It looks like there's promise to that.
Let me ask a question. How long could that extend the life of somebody's in their 50s, let's just say, aloxastatin?
Well, we don't know because that research has never been done. So
okay.
all I can say is that the pathways that it's effective on are the pathways that we're seeing in things like Alzheimer's and ALS and those types of diseases. So it's the mechanism that I focus on disease or the name of the drug. You could call it alpha 223, and it wouldn't matter to me if it had that same mechanism of action. And niacin has been shown to be extremely effective on a number of these, as have the high doses of vitamin C. But you have to get a barrier. All three of those seem to have the potential for doing that. Those are the biggest arguments for it. But then I would also point out, listen to me give too many lectures, possibly, where instead of just ignoring what people consider mainstream medicine and go what people consider alternative medicine, and I don't like those terms, but that's probably what people use to kind of, differentiate. That
Right.
the combination of those two typically have been shown to be more prominent than either one alone. The augmenting effect of using them to work together, certain this separation and mentality occurs. And I would like to encourage people to encompass all look at how they may be synergistic, and we won't know that without the research. Again, one of the promises of FMTVDM is more rapidly looking at drug combinations or treatments for anything and run them through faster, because we can actually measure what works and doesn't work, and the amount of time it would take the FDA to clear a drug to know whether it works or doesn't work would be significantly reduced with it. Not to mention the fact the person actually being treated, there's a real benefit to looking at and getting information that says, yes, this treatment's working. No, this treatment isn't working. Isn't making you better, but it's stopping the disease from making you worse. And in and of itself, that's a win when you have something like amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, a number of other health problems.
Okay. All right. So let's move on to the next question. For the people out there, long haul, maybe COPD, long haul, lung cancer, long haul, some type of asthma, how would the nicotine patch, because now these doctors aren't giving all the information, how would a nicotine patch affect those people with some type of a lung issue?
Well, to begin with, one of the effects of nicotine is that it narrows your airways. Okay? And if it narrows your airways, you're moving less air in and out through your lungs. So it's actually impairing your breathing. You think it makes you feel better because people, that old smokers commentary with, they wake up and cough, and then they smoke and the cough goes away, and their comment is, see, I'm better. Now I'm not hacking, right? Well, the reality is the cigarettes, the nicotine and the other chemicals paralyze the little hairs, they're called cilia, in the airways that are designed to clean out garbage and get it out of the lungs. So when you're not smoking, the hairs come back, no longer paralyzed. And so when you wake up in the morning, they're trying to clear all that garbage, to clear it. But smokers go, well, that feels terrible. Yeah, it feels terrible because you were smoking and putting nicotine in there and paralyzing the mechanism to protect your lungs from developing an pneumonia. And now they're trying to work, so you smoke and paralyze them again. And by the way, one of the most riveting things that any of us saw when I was a first-year medical student, when we did our gross anatomy cadaver lab and we cut into the chest of people, is you could see who'd been a smoker and who hadn't been a smoker. the difference between pink lungs and literally black lungs, because once some of those components get into the lungs, they don't get out. Your immune system comes to clean them out, collects the material, and then dies because it's that toxic. And so you can see the difference between these beautiful pink lungs, which are what we're born with, and these black lungs, black spotted lungs in some cases where it's not as bad, permanently damaged. And, so there's no benefit from that. We also know that the nicotine, when everybody's worried about the sudden cardiac death from all these athletes, I think I've put you through this and other people at conferences where I've explained that it's really the effect on the sodium channels of the heart that are being slowed down, which means your heart can't beat as fast. And then you have the infection from COVID, or you have the amyloid disease from COVID, which causes heart damage, which means it interferes with all these sodium channels, so your heart can't go as fast. And then you put nicotine into your system that stimulates your heart rate. And it's that faster heart rate, whether you're running or ill, running a fever, or smoking a cigarette or inhaling nicotine or putting nicotine in your body, that causes that bad rhythm that kills people. So that's a great mechanism for killing people. Adding that nicotine to your body is a great way, if you have any heart concerns, to kill yourself with that bad rhythm. And I beat those pathways to death several times, and I think I've shown them to you here on this program for your listeners.
Yes.
And you've certainly seen them at conferences where I've explained this to people. There's, and then you couple the fact that it impairs your immune system. It activates the inflammothrombotic response of nuclear factor kappa beta, of interleukin 6, of tissue necrosis factor. By the way, all the things that go up with ALS are driven up with nicotine.
Okay.
Right?
So, I don't know. It's just been so interesting. I just, I hate watching those videos because I just feel that it's not filled with the truth. And so many people around the world are now doing it. I've a couple of my friends who have recently texted me and they said, "Oh, we watched this video on artists." And I'm like, do not start anything until you've listened to our podcast today. And that's all the misinformation that's being driven. What would you think the withdrawal period would be if someone attempted to, one, not listen to you on this podcast and said, "Oh, I'm going to try it anyway"? What would the withdrawal period be if somebody did attempt to try it?
So, I'm not sure I understand that.
How long would it take somebody to get addicted, and then how long would it take them to withdraw off of a nicotine path?
So smoking and nicotine are probably the most interesting addiction that's out there because it turns out to be one of those drugs that the addiction is almost immediate because of the high that people get. There's not been a study that says if you smoke it for this amount of time, now you're addicted, versus if you smoked it for a shorter period of time, you're not addicted. Addiction is both a physiologic function and a psychological function for people.
Right.
We know that if you measure the blood levels of the nicotine, that it peaks, the nicotine addiction, physiologic addiction, peaks at about 2 to 3 days. At 1 day, the psychological addiction kicks in, where people go, "I've got to have a cigarette. I like that dopamine hit, that stimulatory effect." but it's when you draw the blood levels and you compare what's really going on biochemically in the body, it tends to be 48 to 72 hours that it's peaking in the drug effect. And if you can stay off it for a week, you basically beat it down to zero level in the blood, and you're not physically addicted anymore. It's just psychologically addiction that you're dealing with. And people, quit smoking for a while and then they go back to it because that psychological addiction is there. So it's unique. It is the one addiction that we know of chemically that people go on, that the more they try to quit, the greater the chance that they'll be able to quit. But there's no guarantee in it because everybody's a little bit differently on what's setting them off psychologically, for the psychological addiction.
Okay. So just a couple wrap-up questions. Just the benefit for our audience listening. Why do you think that big government and big pharma, why do they allow this? I mean, they know it's harmful. They know it's addictive. And I know you're kind of playing a role out there in the whole.
Why do they allow nicotine?
Yeah, why do they keep just allowing it? I mean, now they used to say, "Hey, listen, it's not harmful," and now it's like, "Hey, it may cause cancer." So, I mean,
So
obviously there's chemicals in there that they can manipulate, not even accounting for the tobacco that is grown with, with the herbicides, glyphosate, Roundup, 2,4-D, which is even, more dangerous because now you're pretty much just smoking all these chemicals. But why is this continued to allow, especially because now we're in this whole MAHA, make America healthy again. And I know you play a big role in that, in what you do, but why is this continually being allowed? And will the MAHA, will it play a role in being able to stop these companies, these cigarette companies, from being able to continue to do what they're doing, which basically is just killing people with cancer?
So I would say that the number one reason why this is allowed is it generates tax revenue, right?
Profits over people.
And with that in mind, I do not think that the federal government is ever going to get rid of it. Now, I firmly believe it's important to tell people the harm of that. And, I've done smoking cessation classes with students. I have done smoking cessation with individuals that, I've worked with nursing staff and respiratory therapists who surprisingly are two groups of very large smokers within hospitals. We used to, when I was back in the 70s, when you could still smoke in classrooms at university, and I would teach the general public why smoking was bad and that it would increase your heart rate and blood pressure immediately. I would take smokers, sit them in the front of the classroom, bring other students up that knew how to take blood pressures and heart rates, let them do it so I wasn't biasing it, then let the students, test subjects, smoke, and then have them repeat the blood pressure and heart rate check. And you can see the heart rate and blood pressure shoot up right away. And it makes the platelets, the thromboxane A2 platelets, get activated to make blood platelets want to clump together and form clots. That's another effect of nicotine. Really, really brilliant idea, artists. Talking about trying to promote everything else plus a heart attack or stroke. So, I don't see the government interfering with that because somebody's going to say, well, you have the right to choose.
True. If they can find the information that can be found on this podcast.
Yeah, I think we have an obligation to you can make an argument for we shouldn't get rid of the generally recognized as safe products, the grass, all the additives in food, because you should have a right to choose, right?
Right.
I don't know if I want to get into that argument with people, because it's a no-win scenario. I think the argument has to be, isn't it our job that if we know something is a bad idea, we should tell you? I mean, if you go to Germany, they don't have speed limits, right? They
Right.
have generally recognized as safe speeds, but they don't have speed limits. But then again, if you kill somebody, it's murder, right?
Yeah.
And I'm in favor of that one, because if you're driving 2,000 pounds worth of material and you kill somebody, you know what? You killed somebody.
Right.
Might be manslaughter, might be second-degree murder, but you still killed somebody. You got
Unless
drunk.
they're in America and then Biden's pardoning them. So,
Well, listen, I may be a bad time to say it, but I'm going to say it anyway. I warned people about going down this track of going after the vaccines versus going after the viruses, and then following the viruses. After that, you'd have the argument for the vaccines. It looks, if you look at that continuing resolution bill, if you look at those 1,500 pages, those vaccine manufacturers, they're going to get scot-free off with this, because people kept beating the wrong dead horse on this, instead of recognizing that we got here because of biological viral weapons that were being built, and everything was a consequence to that. So that wraps into the, everybody's going to get a pardon. And do we really care about giving people the truth? And I personally believe, as a scientist, physician, attorney, that there's the obligation of telling people the truth. And you know why I said that? Because attorneys, their only goal is to win. They don't care if they hide the truth.
it's all about the money.
It's about the money, sadly. But I think science and medicine, and medicine is one of the sciences. It's only one of the sciences, has an obligation to try to maintain some level of purity and truth in what it's doing, so that we can have confidence that when we say trust the science, we can also then trust the scientists, right?
Right.
And then what the doctors learn, because they're not scientists, they're clinicians, what the doctors learn, they can trust what they've been taught. The second thing the dean of my College of Medicine told us when we entered was 90% of what we would be taught would be wrong, but it was the state of the art at the time of medicine at the time. That was the early 1980s. And we were encouraged, if we were researchers, to go and improve on that. We couldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater, but he was being honest, which is, this is as far as we've gotten in this amount of time, and we can do better, and we should, right? So,
well, I think 2025, we're pretty hopeful, but let's summarize this for our audience. I would like for you to kind of summarize why there's false information in the nicotine patch and long haul COVID, and then give your final comment to what would you tell some of these doctors that are recommending the nicotine patch for long haul COVID?
Right. So the effect of the nicotine, whether it's patch or gum or whatever, or cigarettes, is that it's pro-inflammatory. It causes inflammatory thrombotic response diseases, the COVID diseases that we're seeing, blood clots, strokes, cancer, high blood pressure. Need I say miscarriages? I mean, do we have to talk about the fact that that's dangerous for women carrying a baby? Causes neurologic problems. It can cause some of the problems as ALS and Alzheimer's, with the effect by simply overexciting the neurons and depleting the neurons and interfering with their function. It can increase your heart rate, your blood pressure, the clotting, the rhythm disturbance that we've all seen athletes die from, which I thought was what we were trying to avoid, those complications. It causes all the things that it claims it's trying to correct. And yet, just with a blind eye, they're not looking at it. So that's the effect. There is no upside to it. And what I would say to the people is don't play scientist if you're not one. Going to Google or seeing that somebody made a comment on something doesn't mean you've discovered the fountain of youth or the answer. It means you've discovered that somebody else has said something, but it doesn't mean you've validated it or there's any truth to it. I mean, we all know there's a lot of stuff on Google or whatever platform you're looking at that's just not valid. And what researchers will tell you, scientists like myself will tell you, that we will frequently do a scientific investigation of something only to discover that what we thought would happen based upon what's been said isn't what happens. But you have to do the science to do that. And when you are telling people to do something and they are trusting you, they are putting their life in your hand. And, I've said this from day one. We're not selling shoes. And the reason why I use that as the example is because when I was working through college, I worked selling shoes for a while. So I know what it's like to sell shoes. And if you sell bad shoes to somebody, the woman who tells you she has a size 4 when she really has a size 7, her foot's going to hurt. And she's going to come back with it and tell you you're a dummy because you gave her the wrong size shoe. That's the worst thing that's going to happen. The worst thing that happens to people who get bad advice on what they put into their body is they have a health problem and sometimes they die.
Okay, that is, there's only truth in what you said today, and I appreciate it. Dr. Fleming, how can people find you on your website to see the work, the inflammothrombotic disease that you're very well known for? I have a dear friend of mine. I know you. We just did a Zoom call, Dr. Nicholas Karapanos, and when I sent him over your information prior to our Zoom call, his wife immediately was like, "Oh my gosh, this is the Dr. Richard Fleming," because he's been following your work for decades. But where can people find you out there in the internet world?
So Fleming Method, just one M in Fleming, all put together, FLEMINGMETHOD.com is a website that I put a lot of material on inflammothrombotic response, on FMTVDM, on SARS, on COVID, on a variety of issues. I'm on Twitter. You just type in my name, you'll find it. Where I'll
Is there anything on the nicotine patch on your website?
If it
There's
is,
so much information. I just thought maybe I would.
If there's something there, it would be under the publications of over 500 papers have been published on COVID. I don't know if there's anything on that because there's frankly nothing. Some things that are so far there's no data to support at all. I don't tend to put some of that on there. There might be something on there. I don't know.
Okay.
I have put things on there about remdesivir and some of the other drugs and mechanisms of action, but acetylcholine receptors are not a part of this virus. Of how it gets into a cell or works on a cell. It is just, it's the equivalent of saying, well, you know what? If you go take a good way to take a drug and to really feel good about yourself is to take methamphetamine. You'll feel really energetic and high while you're doing it. Well, there's no receptors for methamphetamine and SARS either. So it's not going to be there.
Well, I think you and I are, I've listened to a ton of podcasts. I haven't heard anybody talking about the acetylcholine receptors, working with the nicotine at all. It's the first.
That's how it works.
No, I know, I know. So, and then tell us just a little bit about 10 letters, and then we'll say goodnight for now.
So 10letters.org is a website that is out there to allow people to go to it. Just the number 10 followed by the word letters.com. You've got it there on the screen where people can go, and it will say build a letter, and you go there, it will ask for your name and address. That's so we know which governor and attorney general to generate the cover letter to. And then it will put together a formatted letter that you can then print out and mail to your governor or your attorney general, or both. And then it also has a place for you to send to 10 of your friends by email. 10, 20, 30, 10 letters, because we thought you might have at least 10 friends. I have fewer, but many people have more. And then get them to do the same thing so that the attorney generals and the governors get the information about the origins of this virus, how it was funded, who's responsible, so we can criminally indict these people. If I turn out to get the government position that I'm looking at, director of OSTP, the science advisor to the president on the cabinet, this will be one of the things I hand off to the new Attorney General of the United States, all the documents that we have for prosecution to deal with this, because, this is something that has, killed 1.3 million Americans, 8 million people around the world.
My brother was included in that.
Your brother, so many people.
And you know what, Dr. Fleming, I want to put out, because we're just talking about this right before we wrap up. It's not about the vaccine, the shot, the jab, however you want to look at it. It's actually about the gain of function. The virus that is really what is responsible for that. So it's about the gain of function, because even for somebody like me, I do not have the shot, but I've had COVID. So I've had the spike protein. I have no idea what's going to happen to me a couple years down the line, 5 years, 10 years down the line. I will say that I eat healthy and I drink clean. And but it's not about, 10 letters is not about the vaccination.
No.
10 letters is about the harm that has been done because the manipulation of the virus that caused the disease. So COVID-19.
Yeah.
Just so that we can clarify that.
And it's very clear we're not supposed to be building these bioweapons. That's why the 1975 Biological Weapons Convention Treaty was passed. There wouldn't be a treaty if there wasn't such activities going on. That's why
one of your podcasts, and it was like on the Franken speech, who did you with Will? You just did a podcast. This needs to actually get out, even like with Elon Musk, but your podcast. Part of what's in the bill is the funding of these bioweapon labs. Like, why the hell are we, do we have this information that people aren't reading, that we're funding it with American taxpayer dollars? That's freaking crazy at this point, almost 5 years, post pandemic.
Well, that when somebody is given 36 to 48 hours to read a 1,500-page bill, they're not reading that bill.
No.
What they are being told is, listen, we're going to fund your project. We want you to sign off on the bill. There's other projects. We're going to get other people to sign off the bill because they've got their project in that bill. And they don't care. There really should be a point in time. People have criticized doctors and scientists here for not taking and putting everybody's best interest forward by saying, maybe we shouldn't be doing some of this stuff. And yet we have a continuing resolution package right now by elected officials who aren't being criticized for that same flaw, which is asking that fundamental question, maybe we shouldn't be doing this. You know what? Here's a thought. Shut the government down. We've done it several times. I've noticed we keep funding. We keep working. Our military doesn't quit. These men and women don't say, I'm sorry, we're going home. You're not paying us. Doctors and nurses don't quit. People don't quit their job. What was it? I heard the estimate: 16% of the government would basically be furloughed, and they're going to get their money in the end anyway.
Right.
Shut the government down. If it's that, you know what? Shut it down. And guess what? President-elect Trump, then has the perfect excuse for putting all of his appointments through because Congress isn't in session.
Yeah.
Shut it down.
There we go. And Dr. Fleming, I know that, we kind of mentioned some of the stuff that was going on, but you are a medical doctor, you're a PhD. So when we're talking on YouTube and some of the stuff, because you are a medical doctor and you are a scientist, and you are one of the leading researchers in the world on what's going on with everything that's related to this virus. I just want to put that out to anybody listening to us on YouTube. Anyway, thank you so much. I do think we should have a follow-up maybe next month where we talk about what your solutions would be to Longhaul, since you have so many followers. So it's not the nicotine patch, nice and could be your friend. I would definitely do a little bit further research if you know anybody who actually is on. I know I have a new client and her friend is on it. If you know somebody really thinking about, doing the nicotine patch, you may want to pass our podcast along. You can find us on Poisoned Power. That's our Rumble channel. You can find me also at my website, which is stopsprayingglyphosate.com. Glyphosate is the active ingredient in Roundup. You can always find us on kmmu.org. We are mainstreetmediautah.org, where we talk about the truth. We have the unfiltered truth, and oftentimes, as we know it, on what we're seeing out there, even with popular doctors like Dr. Brian Ardis, you're not getting the truth on what is happening or what could happen with that nicotine patch. So Dr. Fleming, thank you very much for busting the myths out there. Thank you for always caring about people, caring about their health, caring about their immune system. But more importantly, thank you for being the scientist that you are. I appreciate doing podcasts with you, and you have a good night.
You too. Thank you for the invitation. Good night, everyone.
Good night, young man.